Chevrolet's new 5-speed transmission is a lot in a small package. It's sporty, it's economical, it's small, it's fully synchronized, and it's practical. The oval case and the extension housing are of die-cast aluminum and are heavily ribbed and strong. The shift linkage is completely enclosed, and the extension housing bolts are outside the case to provide maximum mating surface. Room temperature vulcanizing, RTV, is used as the sealer rather than gaskets for the case and housing junction, since this material fills any voids in metal-to-metal contact and is highly leak resistant. This new unit is produced by Borg-Warner and is called the T50 5-speed manual floor shift transmission. The shift pattern follows that of conventional 3-speed transmissions. Its single-rail shift mechanism is simple and rugged and responds to shift lever movements by selecting and operating a first and reverse shift link, a second and third shift link, or a fourth and fifth gear shift link. Shifting from second to third and third to second for city driving and fourth to fifth and fifth to fourth for highway driving is easy, positive, and quick. Helical gears give reliable, quiet service for all ranges. The gears are in constant mesh and are engaged or disengaged in the drivetrain by synchronizers. Although the gears rotate whenever the car is moving, only one set of gears can be engaged at a time by the shift controls. The T50 transmission provides gear ratios of 3.41 to 1 for first gear, 2.08 to 1 for second gear, 1.40 to 1 for third gear, 1 to 1 for fourth gear, 0.80 to 1 for fifth gear, and 3.36 to 1 for reverse. Although many of the internal components of this transmission are similar to the regular Vega 4-speed, there are repair methods and procedures that are unique to this 5-speed. For this reason, this program will show you the details involved in disassembly and reassembly of the transmission. First, let's consider the steps involved in removing the transmission from the vehicle, and then get into the disassembly and reassembly. To begin, remove the screws that hold the chrome bezel ring to the tunnel and remove the bezel by slipping it over the boot and shift lever. With the transmission shift lever in the neutral position, hold the boot out of the way and remove the 4 bolts that secure the shift lever assembly to the transmission. Then remove the lever assembly. With the vehicle on a lift, remove the prop shaft U-joint nuts and washers. Pry the shaft forward slightly with a screwdriver to free it and remove the shaft from the vehicle. Next, remove the nut from the front torque arm attaching bolt, then the 2 catalytic converter support bracket bolts, then the 3 damper attaching bolts, and finally remove the damper. Be sure to brace the damper as you remove the last nut and bolt to prevent dropping it. Remove the 2 bolts that hold the transmission rubber mount to the support, and then raise the transmission to take the weight off the support. Remove the 2 long end bolts and remove the transmission support. Then remove the speedometer cable and TCS backup light. Finally, remove the floor jack and reposition it under the bell housing or engine. Then remove the 4 bolts that secure the transmission to the bell housing and lower the transmission out of the vehicle. Place the transmission on the workbench and drain the automatic transmission fluid. Keep in mind that there are loose needle bearings in the center support bearing race and in the input shaft that are of similar design and size. When disassembling the transmission, be sure to keep these needle bearings separate so that they can be returned to their proper location during reassembly. To begin the disassembly, remove the plug, poppet spring, and lock plunger from the transmission extension housing. Also, remove the backup light TCS switch. Then remove the selector lever pivot. Next, drive the spring pin from the shifter head and shift rail. It's okay to let the pin fall into the housing for retrieval when the housings are separated later. Remove the bolts that secure the rear extension housing and the case to the center support. And remove the extension housing and case. It may be necessary to tap the housing and case with a plastic hammer to break the seals with the center support. This stage of disassembly shows one of the unique features of the 5-speed transmission. The gear train and shifting mechanisms are assembled onto the input and output shafts. The housings fit over the transmission components and are bolted together. This is quite a change from inserting parts into a case to build up a transmission assembly. Another outstanding visible feature is the constant mesh helical gears for all operating ranges. Shifting controls are such that only one operating range can be engaged at a time. When the 4th and 5th gear synchronizer is moved forward, the output shaft is locked to the input shaft. This position is 4th gear or direct drive, so the other two synchronizers are in neutral and the counter shaft and other gears are free running. When the 4th and 5th gear synchronizer is moved rearward, power flows from the input drive gear to the counter gear. The counter gear drives the 5th range gear, which is locked to the output shaft by the synchronizer. The result is that the output shaft makes one complete revolution for every 8/10 of input shaft revolution. All other gears meshed with the counter gear cluster are free running because they are not locked to the output shaft. First gear is engaged when the first and reverse speed synchronizer is moved rearward. The power flow illustration identifies the gears that are working. Reverse range goes into effect when the first and reverse synchronizer is moved forward. Power flow is from the input shaft to the counter gear, to the reverse idler gear, and then to the driven gear locked to the output shaft by the synchronizer assembly. Second gear is engaged when the second and third speed synchronizer is moved forward. Power flow is from the input shaft to the counter gear and then to the locked-in second speed gear. Third gear is engaged when the second and third gear synchronizer is moved rearward to lock the third gear to the output shaft. The illustration shows the working gears in this range. With the principles of power flow in mind, let's continue the disassembly by removing the pin and rail selector from the shift rail shaft. Then press down on the speedometer gear retainer tab and remove the gear and the retainer. Then remove the snap ring, thrust washer, first speed gear and blocking ring from the output shaft. Group the parts on the bench. Next, remove the snap ring from the synchronizer hub and position the interlock pawl so that you can remove the first and reverse shift link. Slide the first and reverse synchronizer, shift fork and rail rearward from the transmission. Keep these parts in a separate group. Remove the reverse idler gear from its shaft and slide the reverse gear from the output shaft. Be careful with removed parts, especially needle thrust bearings, during disassembly. Position the interlock pawl and remove the second and third speed shift link and shift fork. Then position the interlock pawl and remove the 4th and 5th speed shift link and fork. Keep the parts in separate groups. Remove the center support housing. And remove the needle thrust race and bearing and the cluster gear from the output shaft. Place the removed parts on a separate, safe section of the bench. Remove the remaining components from the main shaft and clean them in solvent. Be sure to keep them in their respective groups. Wash the housings thoroughly with cleaning solvent and inspect the cases for cracks or burrs. If any burrs are noted, dress them with a fine mill file. If there is a crack in the case or damage to the bearing bores, the case must be replaced. After cleaning and inspecting, replace any damaged parts prior to assembly. Begin assembly by placing the third gear, the gear with 27 teeth, with the coned end up, over the output shaft and against the shaft shoulder. Then assemble the synchronizer if it has been disassembled. Keep in mind that the synchronizer assemblies are very similar, except that the hub splines are of different sizes. The hubs and sleeves are selectively fitted to obtain a free sliding fit with a maximum of 2/1000 of an inch of backlash. Assemble the 3 shift plates in the second and third synchronizer hub slots. This hub has 35 teeth in the event you need to check it. Then assemble the sleeve over the hub and shifter plates. The chamfer on one end of the sleeve may be assembled to either end of the hub. Then insert one synchronizer spring in the inside of the hub so that it seats in the groove on each shift plate. The next step is to place the other spring in the hub on the other side of the synchronizer. Be sure that the gaps of the two springs are 180 degrees apart. 8 to 15 pounds of force should be required to shift a sleeve from the detent position once the springs are installed. Assemble the blocking rings with the slots aligned with the shift plates of the synchronizer assembly. Then assemble the synchronizer and blocking rings over the output shaft and position them on the face of the third speed gear. It may be necessary to use a plastic hammer to gently tap the synchronizer back in place. Place a snap ring in the output shaft groove ahead of the synchronizer hub. Then assemble the second speed gear, the one with 34 teeth, with the coned end into the blocking ring. Place a thrust washer on the face of the gear and a snap ring in the shaft groove in front of the thrust washer. The next step will be to place the 22-tooth fifth speed gear against the thrust washer and assemble one needle spacer over the shaft into the gear bore. Be sure to select the right needles and place 46 of them into position. Use petroleum jelly to retain the needles. Follow with a second spacer, another row of needles, and a third spacer. Be sure that the third spacer is held firmly in place with petroleum jelly. If this spacer should fall out, it will wedge between the fifth speed gear and the synchronizer. This causes a binding condition once the transmission is near final assembly. Note that there is a gap left in each row of needle bearings. This is a normal production condition and should not be changed by adding an additional needle bearing to fill the row. With the fifth gear in place, put the blocking ring and the assembled fourth and fifth synchronizer on the shaft. Then replace the next blocking ring and the bearing. Assemble 19 needle rollers with petroleum jelly to hold them in place into the second step of the input shaft bore, and carefully place the input shaft over the end of the output shaft. Now mesh the cluster gear with the input shaft gear. The gears are assembled to the output shaft, and the cluster gear and input shaft are positioned for assembly to the center support. Now assemble the bearing and thrust plates over the input shaft and replace the bearing and spacer on the output shaft end. Install the needle rollers into the center support races with petroleum jelly or low melting point grease. Assemble the center support over the output shaft and cluster gear, then install the 35-tooth reverse gear and bushing over the output shaft and rest it on the center support. Install the 19-tooth reverse idler gear and bushing over its shaft. Replace any damaged or worn shift pads on shifter forks at this point if necessary. The shift links and forks should be selected for the next series of assembly. As shown here, they are identified for second and third, first and reverse, and fourth and fifth ranges. Note the angle of the hole for each shift fork. Now assemble the fourth and fifth link into its shift fork. Position the interlock pawl to permit the shift link to be assembled through the outboard slot of the center support when the transmission is viewed from the rear. Then engage the shift fork into its synchronizer collar. Position the interlock pawl to permit installation of the second and third speed shift link into the middle slot. Then install the link and engage the shift fork on the synchronizer. Now position the interlock pawl to assemble the first and reversed shift link in the inboard slot of the center support and assemble the reverse shift link into the shift fork. This next step is critical and must be completed carefully, since you are performing several operations at one time. With the shift rail, fork, lever, and synchronizer assembled, slide the assembly onto the transmission so that the synchronizer aligns on the shaft and seats properly. The tangs on the shift rail are aligned with the slots on the interlock pawl. The first and reverse shift link is aligned, and the rail is aligned with all of the shift forks. Then install the snap ring in the shaft groove to secure the assembly. Now assemble a blocking ring and the 38-tooth first-speed gear over the output shaft behind the first and reverse synchronizer assembly, and assemble a thrust washer and snap ring behind the gear. Next, install the speedometer gear retainer into its locating hole in the output shaft and slide the speedometer gear over the retainer until the retainer end snaps up to its lock position. Then slide the rail selector end over the end of the shift rail with the hole located to the rear of the transmission. Note that the selector could be mounted in any of 4 different positions, but there is only one right way, with the ball inboard and using the hole closest to the end of the rail as shown. Drive the spring pin into the selector and rail to secure these parts. With the assembly completed, take time to manually turn the shift rail and check to be sure that all of the gears engage properly and that there is no internal binding. Press a new oil seal into the extension housing using the proper installation tool. And inspect the extension housing bearing. If there appears to be any damage, remove it with the tool shown and replace the bearing. Carefully inspect the oil seal and roller bearings for the case, and if they show any signs of wear, replace them. Then apply a continuous bead, approximately 1/32 of an inch, of Celastic RTV 732 sealer or equivalent to the transmission case and extension housing faces. Now, assemble the selector lever and shift rail into the hole in the extension housing and assemble the shifter head onto the rail as the rail becomes exposed in the housing opening. Do not install the spring retaining pin at this time. Push the rail selector end into the extension housing end hole as the extension housing is assembled over the output shaft and brought into contact with the center support rear face. Then, assemble the lip thrust race, needle thrust washer, and flat thrust race over the input shaft and assemble the case to the front side of the center support. Next, install the 6 hex head bolts to retain the rear extension housing and transmission case to the center support. At this point, install the spring pin into the shifter head and shift rail. Apply Loctite number 92 or the equivalent to the extension housing thread and replace the selector lever pivot. Finally, install and secure the switches into the extension housing. And assemble the transmission mesh lock plunger, poppet spring, and threaded plug. With a magnet, lower the plug into the case with the flat end up and the half round end down. With the transmission completely assembled and filled with automatic transmission fluid, install it in the vehicle by reversing the steps that you performed in the removal. You may want to install guide bolts through the bell housing holes to help align it while making the installation. Finally, install the shift lever using care to make sure it is properly aligned. When it is in place and properly secured, try the shift patterns to be sure that the transmission works properly in all gears. A road test will complete the repair. In this program, we have covered the features of the new T50 5-speed transmission. The practical features of constant mesh gears and positive shifting gives promise of a transmission that will prove to be extremely efficient and reliable. The direct shift design makes diagnosis equally direct. If you encounter a transmission that won't shift readily into a range, such as second to third, you know the problem has to be confined to the second and third synchronizer or possibly to shift cover alignment. If you encounter a complaint of excessive gear rattle, the problem is probably worn insulator pads on the shifting fork. We have examined the importance of cleanliness and of being organized. Care during disassembly to group needle bearings and other parts will save assembly time. By following the procedures we have covered, you will be giving your customer quality service for his 5-speed manual transmission whenever he may need it.